5 Spider-Man villains in total appear throughout the Spider-Man trilogy, and 3 of this 5 are usually considered as candidates for Spider-Man's primary arch-nemesis. We get one villain in 2002's Spider-Man, the Green Goblin. We get one villain again in Spider-Man 2, Doc Ock. We then get a total of 3 villains in Spider-Man 3, the Sandman, Venom, and the New Goblin. But you already know all this. Let's instead look at what villains were at some point considered for the Spider-Man trilogy, but ultimately went unused. The Spider-Man villains that Sam Raimi was most eager to bring into his Spider-Man films were foes that appeared during the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and Stan Lee, John Romita runs. This was because these eras were Raimi's favourites. These were the comics he grew up reading as a young fan of Marvel Comics. It also so happens the vast majority of Spider-Man's most iconic foes appear during these initial runs. This is also why Raimi had an initial distaste for Venom when the studio wanted him to incorporate the character into Spider-Man 3. Venom was from an era of Spider-Man comics Raimi was unfamiliar with, an era that had moved on from the tones of Lee and Ditko, and instead into the era of darker and edgier comics that had started appearing during the 1980s. But let's not go off track here. Which villains did we almost get in Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy? What villains were in initial drafts that ultimately didn't make the final cut? And what villains could we have seen appear in the Raimiverse in films that didn't get made? Well, there are indeed several. So let's go over all the villains we almost could have got in the Spider-Man trilogy. Spider-Man 1 went through many changes during pre-production. The film was stuck in development hell before Sam Raimi got the job, and many iterations of a script for a first Spider-Man film existed throughout the 80s and 90s, including a version by James Cameron, which has been covered considerably. Evidence suggests, however, that elements of this draft seem to have made its way through to David Koepp's early drafts for Raimi's Spider-Man, such as the concept for organic webbing, and using Mary Jane Watson as the primary love interest. As for the villains, they also seem to have been carried over from Cameron's script to Koepp's initial drafts. Cameron's script included Sandman and Electro as the main antagonists, and Koepp kept them both for his draft, but added Doc Ock as an additional third villain. So, the villains initially lined up for 2002's Spider-Man were the Sandman, Electro, and Doc Ock. Swapping these foes out in favour of a more streamlined movie that solely focuses on the Green Goblin was a wise move by Raimi. When it comes to Spider-Man 2, it appears that Doc Ock was always meant to be the main villain of the film, and that makes perfect sense. After the Green Goblin, Doc Ock is Spidey's most famous foe. As for other potential villains who may have joined Doc Ock, there doesn't seem to have been as many on the shortlist, but there was at least one that was considered for sure. According to Al Gough and Miles Miller, 2 of the writers who worked on Spider-Man 2, and who were also the showrunners of Smallville back in the day, Black Cat almost made it into their drafts. Apparently, her plotline would have been similar to what the Spider-Man 2 game did with her. And as to whether the developers of Spider-Man 2 got this idea from the writers of the film, however, I do not know, but I find it unlikely. It's also possible that a version of Harry Osborn's New Goblin could have appeared, as David Koepp's draft of Spider-Man 2 included an adaptation of Gwen Stacy's death, which would have required a role for another version of the Goblin. The production of Spider-Man 3 is far more documented than the previous 2 in the trilogy, due to how infamous the production was. As for villains, Raimi always intended for the Sandman to be the primary antagonist. Though Raimi never intended for Spider-Man 3 to be a solo villain movie, and always wanted to include another villain alongside the Sandman. This foe was to be the Vulture, and this idea survived production long enough for Ben Kingsley to be in negotiations for the part. Concept art, plot layouts, and even a prototype for the Vulture's wings were also produced, with the initial idea being that the Sandman would be working with the Vulture. One scene we know for sure that was planned, due to released concept art, was that the Vulture himself would have been the one to break Flint Marko out of prison. However, as we all know, this was never meant to be, and instead Venom took his place. Now, time for the big one. Had the various details we know about Spider-Man 4 been in the finished film, we could have seen a lot more iconic Spider-Man villains get the Raimiverse treatment. The majority of these villains would have had fleeting appearances that would have appeared during an opening montage, fighting against Spider-Man. Concept art of this montage giving us a good idea as to how it would have played out was released in 2016 by Spider-Man 4 storyboard artist Jeffrey Henderson. In an interview with comicbookmovie.com, Henderson spoke more about the villains who would have appeared, stating that those featured were C and D list villains that we knew would never be used as main antagonists. Mysterio, the Shocker, the Prowler, the old school onesie wearing version of the Rhino, and maybe even the Stiltman, etc. Now this quote is rather interesting. The quote implies that this list of villains was incomplete or still in flux by the time production on Spider-Man 4 ended. Unless of course Henderson simply couldn't remember the entire gallery of foes that were to be included. As for who would have portrayed this colourful collection of criminals is unknown, apart from Mysterio of course, who would have been used for Bruce Campbell's traditional cameo appearance. Oh, that would have been good. For the main antagonists of the film however, Raimi was still keen on using the Vulture, but this time John Malkovich was in talks for the part. The Black Cat also would have joined the Vulture in this film, after being briefly considered for Spider-Man 2, and some believe that Felicia Hardy would not actually have been the Black Cat, but instead a new creation known as the Vulturess. Okay. Raimi however clarified in a 2013 interview that Felicia Hardy would have indeed been the Black Cat, and that Anne Hathaway was in negotiations to play the part. Anne Hathaway later confirmed this in a 2023 interview, where she stated that if Spider-Man 4 had indeed been made, she would have missed out on the role of Catwoman in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight Rises. For a time during production of Spider-Man 4, plans on Spider-Man 5 and 6 were concurrently also being planned. As for which villains would have featured in those films, we can only make one definite guess, which would be the Lizard. A villain Raimi had properly set up way back in Spider-Man 2, and continued to do so in Spider-Man 3, with the inclusion of a skeleton of a lizard visible in the background of Dr. Connor's lab. Raimi was certainly interested in using the Lizard as a villain. Even Dylan Baker, who played Dr. Connors, understandably wanted to get the story going, as was Spider-Man 3 producer Grant Curtis. I think this is one of the biggest tragedies of the Spider-Man trilogy that seems to get overlooked. If Spider-Man 4 had come out, then it would seem that Dr. Connors would have been featured in 3 Spider-Man films without actually getting to transform into the Lizard. I'm not quite sure as to why Raimi was holding out for so long on using the Lizard. The character to me felt like the more fitting choice for use in Spider-Man 4, but alas. Towards the cancellation of Spider-Man 4, Raimi stated that 5 and 6 were no longer being planned, so perhaps it was never destined to see Dylan Baker's Dr. Connors ever transform into the Lizard. So, there we have it. Those were the villains we could have got in the Spider-Man trilogy. and maybe we did in an alternate timeline. Ultimately, I'm happy with the selection of foes we did get in the 3 movies, though I'd be lying if I said that I wouldn't have wanted to see just what Raimi would have done with the villains mentioned in this video. I suppose, in the end, the closest we will ever get to seeing an expanded Raimiverse Rogues Gallery will be in the Spider-Man Trilogy games, and that's fine by me. But now it's your turn to let me know which of these villains you most would have liked to have seen in the Raimiverse. Or perhaps you would have liked to have seen other foes that were not mentioned here. Either way, let's talk. Comment and let me know below. And while you're here, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more Raimi Spider-Man content. My aim here is to create a community for fans of the Spider-Man trilogy, so we can discuss all aspects of it and keep the films alive. Anyway, that's all for now. I'll see you next time, Webheads. And remember, with great power comes great responsibility.